thing that we know about healing from mental illness or any type of mental health distress is that the 3 Ps, like the letter P, they call them the 3 Ps, are very important. And it's people, place, and purpose. And so just thinking about that, I had all 3. And so I think that those are things that we can have too much of or not enough of. Hi, I'm Sarah Fay, and I'm the author of Pathological, the true story of 6 misdiagnoses. And today on Ever Forward, I talk about mental health diagnoses, what they are, where they come from, how I lived through 6 of them, and how we can embrace them and understand them better, but also move toward the future.
Well, thank you so much for making time to come on the show. A quick little backstory, of me. Everforward Radio, we're going on almost 6 years, and my background is really all things health, wellness, physical, mental, emotional. I was a clinical health coach for many years and kind of got out of that in late 2017 to do my own online health coaching business as well as the podcast. And now it's kind of just Everforward Radio the last 3 years. And very excited and honored to connect with people in the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual well-being worlds, both professionally and people that have just really unique personal experiences. And then people like yourself who have this kind of alchemy of both, and then write a book about it, basically.
I really enjoy the podcast. I've been listening, and also the bonuses of U-Turn. I was just listening to the money mindset one.
With Ashley Stahl. Yeah, we did a little pod swap and Chris Harder. Yeah, that was a fun project.
It was cool. I'm really liking. I like your episodes as well. And I was listening to the editor of Men's Health. That one was really great.
Ebenezer Samuel. Yeah.
Yes, Ebenezer Samuel. Yeah.
He's a beast. He's a beast for sure. Yeah, he knows his stuff. Well, that's amazing. Well, then you kind of have an understanding of the flow of the show, and it's got a couple ideas and concepts in mind, but I always try to just make it as organic and here and now as much as possible. And so I'll ask you kind of the same question I do everybody, and that's what's on your mind, on your heart the most today as it pertains to your work, and how can we make sure to honor this conversation for you and your work the most?
I think, I'm writing the sequel to Pathological right now, which is kind of great. And so I'm working on that, and my head is very much there, which is how I healed from mental illness. And the fact that we're told that we can't, but that's absolutely not true. And there's no evidence to suggest that. So I think it's that, I went through this very extreme bummer of a 25 years is putting it mildly, but that there's so much hope after that. And there's just been so much that's been amazing. And the struggle to heal was as brutal as what I went through, but it was well worth it. So I guess that's just because I'm writing it, that's on my mind, but amazing. We can talk about anything.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. Looking forward to the follow-up. And I got to say, when I first came across your work and this book, I was expecting this. I was very naive to everything that was going on, but I was kind of expecting like a thriller, a novel kind of situation. The look, the title, I could just imagine maybe where the story was going to go. And then once I realized, no, this was real life. This is actually something that you went through for many, many years. Did it kind of feel like a story, like somebody else's life? Did you kind of feel like you were just watching somebody else's movie or reading this suspense novel, and then you're like, no, that's actually my life?
Absolutely. Every time I read, but Anthony Swafford, who he wrote Jarhead. He's just an amazing writer, and I just respect him. And he was kind enough to blurb the book, and he writes that it's a medical thriller. And I love thrillers, so I was so flattered by that. But a lot of people say it's a page turner, and they just can't put it down. And I think it's that. And Tony said that he felt like he opened these pages, and it opens when I'm in 8th grade and I get my first diagnosis, which is so young to get a diagnosis. You're just not formed yet. You don't have an identity yet. And when someone comes in and says, you are this diagnosis, you take it on. And he said that when he read the book, he was just like, what's going to happen to this kid? And that was, so that is when I read it, and when I read from it, or when I talk about it, I think, I can't believe that this happened to me. But every morning I go for a walk and I have a gratitude practice, which I never had before because it always felt goofy and forced and like, oh, I have gratitude, you better be grateful, that kind of thing. But I've started doing it. And the one thing I do, because I was suicidal for so many years, is I'm just so grateful I didn't do that. I'm so grateful I could write this book. I'm so grateful I can bring it to people. And I hope parents, especially, and young people, so they don't make the mistake I did, which was to identify with a diagnosis at a very young age and then continue to do that throughout my life. So, yeah.
Let's start there if we could. Always a great idea to start at the beginning. But your first diagnosis at such a young age, anorexia, correct?
Yes.
Is one that I think, I'm assuming, I haven't been there, so I'm going to make the assumption here that a lot of people who receive that diagnosis are fairly young when that happens. And it tends to happen during an age or a period of young adulthood, childhood, where you're really just kind of coming to be your own, or at least figuring out who I am for the first time. In high school, you're away from home, maybe in college, or living away from family. And so you're just really, you're in charge of your life for the first time, and that kind of lands on eating habits. Now looking back, eighth grade Sarah, can you kind of see the differences of just young Sarah and this diagnosed Sarah? And, what is your kind of reflection on that now?
Well, there was a circumstance, there was a context for what was happening. My parents were divorcing and I was going to a new high school. I was extraordinarily sad and I was terrified. And so I had this stomach ache and it was like a sodden pit in my stomach and I couldn't eat. It wasn't even just that I didn't want to, I couldn't. And so I hadn't been eating for months. I went on a class trip, an eighth grade class trip. I didn't eat for 4 days. And when I got home, I couldn't hold down food or water. And my parents rightly took me to the emergency room. My our pediatrician happened to be an attending physician there. And he put me on the scale. My mother told him that I hadn't been eating and that I now couldn't hold down food or water. And he said, anorexia. Like he just kind of pronounced it. And so never was the context taken into account. He never said anything about what was going on. He's a pediatrician, he's got to cover so much. And so from that moment, I attached, stomach ache, parents divorcing, trouble, not eating, diagnosis, right? So like I was already starting to attach my emotions, thoughts, and behaviors to a diagnosis, not thinking, wait, this was a context. This was something I was going through. And what I didn't know at the time, and what I wish I could say to my, 12, 13-year-old self, is that I didn't actually display the 3 classic signs of anorexia, which are counting calories, weighing yourself, and believing you're fat. At that time, I didn't have them. But once I was pronounced an anorexic, I actually became one. And I thought, okay, this is what I am. And we didn't have, today we have thinspo and pro-ana sites, which are really destructive in that they, basically counsel young women, especially, although young men obviously have this as well, and everyone along the gender spectrum, but, counsel them on how to be an anorexic. And it's such an interesting term, right? I was an anorexic. I am an anorexic.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't have it. It is me. And I really took that on. But so we didn't have those sites, but there's so many things like that. I actually found a novel by Stephen Levenkron called The Best Little Girl in the World. Ironically, he was Karen Carpenter's psychologist right before she died of anorexia.
Wow.
Or health consequences of anorexia. So I'm not sure why I was reading a book by that guy, but I didn't know that's who it was. And in it, the protagonist is a girl who suffers from anorexia, and the book really takes you, it's almost like a cheat sheet on how to be an anorexic. You cut your food into very small pieces and you don't let that touch your lips because that means you're going to gain weight. And I'm 12 years old. So I'm really like, okay, this is who I am. This is what I am. And I really became it. And I wish I could have just said to her, and I could say it now, is just, first of all, it makes me so sad to think of her and how really innocent I was at the time and how sad I was and how much I was suffering. Is just that this pain that you're going through is not, you are not a diagnosis. That doesn't, your pain is so complex. It's what makes us human. It's what makes you a good person. It's what makes you have empathy for others. If I could just take her through all of this and say, I know it hurts, and it doesn't mean we're not going to go get you help, because we are, because I was doing something that was very, very dangerous. My weight was dangerously low. So that's not to say we don't get help, but we don't define the person, the patient, and all the help only in terms of a diagnosis.
Not to kind of skip ahead, I definitely want to dive into a lot more that you went through in these other diagnoses. But I love how you already have brought this up, and that's, I was not this diagnosis. I was this person experiencing these things, experiencing these symptoms, this state of physical being, mental being, emotional being. And I think that alone right there, if the listener, the viewer picks up nothing else, that is huge, because I think it finally does allow separation from what you are being told you are, who you are being told you are, to a degree. So could you please expand on that? Did you have that realization at all during these times, or again, now with, retrospect or hindsight, I guess, how do you separate yourself from the diagnosis and someone who's just experiencing these things?
Yeah, it's so complicated and so interesting. And no, I had no idea. For someone who spent 25 years in the mental health system, I knew very little about mental health diagnoses and where they come from and what they are and how we should think about them even. That didn't happen until really I had almost taken my life, and I ended up going to a new psychiatrist who my sister found. I have to say, I always like to say my family is really the hero. They're the heroes of this story. And
they played huge roles in your story. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And that happens so often in cases of mental illness, that the families get so little credit and they feel so much helplessness and lack of power.
True
and
caretakers,
confusion.
really.
Yeah, they're caretakers. My mother was my caretaker for 5 years. I couldn't live independently. And I'm so grateful to them. But my sister found a new psychiatrist. I went to see him, and I had been through this a bit, like this drill. And so we had our 27-minute first consultation. And at the end, I waited for him to pronounce a new diagnosis. At this point, I was on my 6th diagnosis. So I was believing I was bipolar, right? I didn't have bipolar disorder. I was it. It very ironically had come full circle in some ways from I am an anorexic to I am bipolar. But I waited for him to either proclaim a new diagnosis or say, yes, you are bipolar, you have bipolar disorder. And he looked at me and he said, I don't know what you have. And like my whole world shifted. I thought, what? Like, first of all, everyone I'd gotten, and many of my diagnoses came from my GPs. So this is not to criticize psychiatry in any way. I can't blame psychiatry at all.
Your family physician, your primary care provider, they were the ones.
Primary care. Okay. Yeah. So, and they're actually doing the majority of, if not the diagnosing, they prescribe 80% of antidepressants right now, and they prescribe 50% of antipsychotics to children. Yet they have only 32 hours on average, not on average, but typically, of psychiatric training. So we've got a problem there. It's meant well in the sense that that's set up so that we can get people access to care. So people who can't see a psychiatrist can see a GP and be diagnosed and get care. So it makes sense.
Gotcha.
But this is all just to say, I was very grateful to this psychiatrist who said, I don't know. It was such a he's not a humble guy, by the way. He's a very arrogant, confident man. And he loves psychiatry. Like, he thinks psychiatry is the most noble profession. But he came to say, I don't know, was so, I just think it had so much humility, so much integrity to say, wait a second, I'm not going to pronounce this diagnosis on you after 27 minutes when I don't have a blood test or an X-ray or a scan that can say, see, here's your brain, and this is how I know you have bipolar disorder. Because the tricky part about mental health diagnoses is that they come from a book. And this is what I didn't know. After I call him, he's Dr. R in the book. He knows he's in the book. He's still my psychiatrist. He's okay with being in the book. And he's a lovely man. And he and I have these conversations all the time now. And again, I think that says so much to his integrity, and that there are many psychiatrists with this kind of integrity as well. But after I saw him and he did that and it rocked my world, I went out and I was like, I'm going to find out everything I can about mental health diagnoses. Like, what were these 6 diagnoses that I've received? Where do they come from? Who invented them? I knew nothing. And it turns out they come from a book. called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, for short, the DSM. And I knew nothing about it, but it's just a book. And, it's often referred to as psychiatry's Bible, for better or worse. But essentially, what happened was in 1952, clinicians decided they needed some way. It started actually in the 19th century, that they wanted to start to order this thing called mental illness. Okay, let's divide it into these different subtypes so we can hopefully not just treat people, but talk to each other in a language of diagnosis to, better communicate with each other. So that's what it was intended to be. So the DSM started in 1950.
I mean, labeling what we're talking about so we have clear communication, not a bad thing, especially in the medical world.
Exactly. Totally. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And in 1952, the DSM started, and it was 128 diagnoses to begin with. And then over the years, we've had different editions. So you might hear DSM-3, DSM-4, DSM-5. That's what that means. 4th edition, 5th edition, that kind of thing. But we're on the 5th edition. We're on the 5th edition revision right now. And we have 541 diagnostic categories. So it has gone up that much. And that's where we start to wonder, what's going on? That is a difficult thing to navigate. The other problem, well, there are several problems, but one is what I was saying, there's no what's called a biological marker. There's no objective measure. There's nothing we can do to say, okay, this is what depression is. This is what it looks like in a brain. Here's your brain, and here's how I know you have depression or major depressive disorder. And instead, the way major depressive disorder came about was Robert Spitzer, who's a really prominent figure in psychiatry. For better or worse, he wanted psychiatry to be a respected field of medicine at a time when it wasn't. He really pushed this idea that all mental illness is biological. It's caused biologically and not kind of to the exclusion of environmental factors and other factors that might be going on in your life. And we now know that's not true.
It's not something that you can develop due to a string of events or a life experience, a traumatic event or events.
Right. And so when, they put together what we now use, this was in 1980, but we still use the same criteria for major depressive disorder. Basically, the DSM, if you open the pages, it would say major depressive disorder at the top, and then it would have lists of symptoms. And for major depression, you would need to get 5 of 9 symptoms. Well, when Robert Spitzer was asked, why do you need 5 of 9 symptoms? Why that number? He said, it was just random. We went around the table and 6 seemed like too many and 4 seemed like too few. I mean, that's major depressive disorder.
The marker was set based on a random agreement from a group of people when we're talking about labeling people and diminishing their quality of life, potentially putting them on a string of prescription medications that have usually a string of side effects.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it's really stunning. And again, for me, it was almost, and I think there might be people listening to this driving who just hit the brakes or something, because it was so difficult for me to learn that when I was my diagnoses. I had been diagnosed with major depressive disorder and OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and a combination of all of those, and generalized anxiety disorder. And each time I really believed I was those things. I was those diagnoses, and I took them on as identities. And even if you don't kind of over-identify the way I did, for a lot of people, a diagnosis can be a lifeline, and it can bring a lot of relief. And I respect that so much. So anyone listening, if you feel destabilized by this, I don't think I understand, first of all, and I've been there. Because I over-identified, it became a gateway. It became a way for me to distance myself from the diagnosis and start to see myself again as a person. Mm-hmm. So that can be a really beautiful thing if you might be, limiting yourself and what you can achieve, which is what I was doing. I mean, I believed I would die young 10 years earlier because that's what I read on the internet. I believed I would never have a long-term relationship. I believed I would never hold a full-time job. I mean, to say that I was limiting myself because of my diagnosis is an understatement.
You were just looking up, okay, if this is me and this is the definition of me and my characteristics and limitations, I mean, how can you not just assume all this to be true? Because you were told it by a medical professional, and on one on top of the other, it's just like, oh, cool. Now that makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. Wow.
Yeah. And so I think it's, and if you don't, if it did come as a relief, that's still there. As we were saying, the DSM is what we have. It's incredibly flawed. It's a shame. There are bad apples in psychiatry, just like there are bad apples in any profession. But I think that it's a way for us to talk about our psychic and emotional pain. And it's all we have right now. So it doesn't mean there isn't something wrong, and it doesn't mean your pain isn't valid, and it doesn't mean, none of those things. It just means that what I hope and what happened for me after I kind of got used to the idea is that people will be empowered knowing the truth, because you're not going to walk into a psychiatrist's office with your 5-year-old daughter and he says she has bipolar disorder. You might say, really? Like, oh, okay. Like, because this is happening. I mean, you can diagnose a child as young as 2. You can diagnose an infant. I mean, it's really incredible. And so what I hope is it will empower parents, especially and young people, to say, yes, this diagnosis feels right. My perfect scenario would have been for a clinician to say to me, look, diagnoses are really flawed. Psychiatric diagnoses are really flawed. They're what we have. They're what I'm going to use to get you the treatment that I think is best for you. Given what you've told me, given what I'm hearing, it sounds like you might have what we call bipolar disorder. Here's what it is. These are the symptoms. Here's the treatment I recommend. Like, that would have been the ideal situation, because then it's a conversation. Then I could have said, those symptoms don't feel right. Like, that doesn't sound like what I'm saying. I'm saying more of anxiety, like that. Not mania, but anxiety. Like, then we can have that conversation and maybe even be more accurate in our treatments.
Did any of these diagnoses really feel like, yes? Was it just acceptance of, all right, the doctor says that I have this, that I am this, so therefore it's all true? Because I know after the fact, you definitely kind of combed through and you began to really become a detective in your own mental health journey. Amazingly so. But did you really feel like, yes, like this one was right? Like this aspect of this is spot on, and it kind of actually does help make sense to my life, and I can now better understand it and, work through things differently, just kind of having this new perspective.
It's really hard, because the problem with DSM symptoms is they're actually common emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. 99% of the quote unquote symptoms in the DSM are things we experience every single day.
Yeah.
Depression, anxiety, insomnia. I mean, and that's not to belittle what someone's going through. If you are going through, a mental health, certainly, difficulties or a crisis. I mean, that's different. I mean, even what was interesting, I was just reading psychosis. We think of that as being so, that's different. That's really off the charts. That's definitely, something different. But I was reading from a psychologist. She was talking about how hearing voices, that when you think about it, when we hear a song in our heads, that's like hearing a voice. I thought that was such an interesting way of looking at, I mean, obviously we don't want destructive when someone, I'm not trying to, again, lessen the like strain and, sort of pain that goes with, extreme psychosis. But I thought that was an interesting way of thinking about really most, if not all, of the symptoms in the DSM are things we experience. So how can I, it was very hard not to see generalized anxiety disorder in myself, hard not to see depression, hard not to see anorexia. I'm a woman socialized in America, like, welcome to disordered eating.
Look at diet culture of the last 10, 15 years. Yeah, I mean,
exactly.
if not a full-blown eating disorder, many of us have gone through disordered eating.
Exactly. I mean, I think that just gets really tricky. And then the other part, so for instance, I'm a really high energy person. So mania, like with bipolar, I thought, well, maybe, I mean, maybe that was worse. I mean, I did blow $26,000 on a, loft in New York that was non-residential, not zoned for residential, and lost it. I mean, were these rash manic decisions? So I could see myself in all of them. But what I do know, and I know this for a fact, is that I had a mental illness and I struggled for 25 years, and mental illness is very real, regardless of what we're going to separate them into. The labels, and I almost don't even want to call them labels because that sounds dismissive, but like the designations that we're using, the diagnoses, may not have spoken to me, but there's no question I needed treatment. There's no question that I was very, very ill. So that's kind of how I look at it now, is that yes, I was ill and none of the diagnoses served me. I mean, I think it's really important to note too, autism is a great example of a diagnosis that can be very positive. I mean, that community is they're so inspiring, and not all, I mean, I'm generalizing here, but they are really empowered by that diagnosis. They've created a new term for it, neurodiversity. They get funding for that diagnosis.
I haven't heard
resources. Yeah, that really the way, that they're calling it neurodivergence. So it's a different way. We're neurotypical if you don't have autism, and it's neurodivergent. It's a different way of thinking rather than like it's not even, I think that many of them would like it not to be thought of as a mental disorder. And I say that with a caveat, which is that I don't think anybody would not want to be able to get services for what they have, what they need. Yeah. So I think that's, again, an example where, a diagnosis can be a positive thing. Now, autism has positive connotations with it because of Asperger's, which is what's thought of as being more high functioning autism, this sort of genius that was associated with it, or this idea that, like the dot-commers, somehow that's their children had autism more than other children and that whole thing. So, but we don't have that with the other diagnoses. I mean, when I was told you have major depressive disorder, there was no upside. No one says to you like, what I learned and what was so empowering for me, it was evolutionary psychiatry, and it has its downsides. I'm not saying it doesn't, and difficulties, but what it taught me is like, wait, we have these brains, and my brain is designed, all our brains are designed to keep us alive. That's it. That's its sole job. It's up there in the dark. Like, how do I keep her alive? And to realize that, I was like, oh, like, no wonder I'm high strung, quote unquote, or anxious, or whatever it might be. To have an anxious brain kept me alive. Like, I was the person you wanted in your clan on the savannah in prehistoric times. Like, I was the one,
She's thinking outside of the box for the rest of the village.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, I see lions everywhere today, but it's just email, or it's just, we just don't, most of us are not living under, at least in America, a lot of us are not living under, physical threat every single day. And so that really helped me see, wait a second, here's this thing that's supposed to be bad, anxiety, when it's really just, it's what my brain does. It just produces it. And once I started seeing it like that and not like this terrible thing to avoid, and I just was like, here it is again, here's that anxiety. My symptoms lessened more than they did with any psychological treatment or any psychiatric drug.
Are you familiar by chance with the work of Dr. Ethan Kross around chatter?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I love him, and I love that book. Absolutely.
He was just on the show a couple of weeks ago. Yes. The episode was out. By the time this was out, it'd probably be a couple months, but I digress. His whole approach to the voice in our head, like you were talking about earlier, I think, and I kind of believed it to be true already, but to hear someone much smarter than myself to really break it down gave me such a sigh of relief to kind of know, what I thought to be just my brain working constantly and feeding me little snippets of information in the voice of mental chatter. Oh, wait, you mean this is real? And like, this is a thing that, actually is here to keep me alive? Whew.
Yeah. And then I kind of like have this really wonderful relationship with my brain now, which is like, thank you.
Oh, what a beautiful
Thanks
thing
for
to
that.
say. Wow.
You know,
Yeah.
like, like it's something ridiculous. Like, I wake up every morning and I write down my thoughts in a list, all just all at once. And they're so negative. They're like, basically, it's just, you're going to die. Like, that is pretty much, like everything's wrong. You're never going to get that interview. I mean, it's just negative,
Worst case
negative,
scenario
negative.
all the time. Yeah.
Totally. And I realized it's just trying to protect me. It's like, don't go out there. There are lions. Stay in the cave where we're safe. Get popcorn. Call it a day.
What a unique thing to say. What a unique perspective. I think, we've been talking about eating disorders, for example, and I think a lot of people on the other side of healing that eating disorder or their disordered eating habits. Yeah. A lot of, I think that recovery is finally developing a healthy relationship with your body. What if we did the same thing for our brains? What if whatever we were struggling with or thought that we were struggling with or told that we have a problem with, a deficit with, what if we made a part of that therapy, a part of that work, developing on bettering or at least establishing for the first time a healthy relationship with that component of ourselves that we are struggling with.
Because I always thought, and especially with the biological explanation of mental illness, which is never, I mean, I do understand it's complicated and I understand it better now, which is that there are so many factors involved. So there's biological factors. There might be hereditary factors. We don't have a lot of evidence for that. Certainly social factors come into play, but so does your personality. And I think it's pretty, I don't know of any evidence for this, but I think it's fair to say how we talk to ourselves is going to have a huge effect on that.
Oh my gosh,
and how we treat our minds. I mean, for years I thought, I believed in the chemical imbalance theory, which was debunked 20 years ago. I didn't get the memo on that one. But supposedly 80% of Americans believe in the chemical imbalance theory. So I was not alone. But I really thought, wait, my brain is just this crazy neurons going everywhere and I'll never be able to control it. And I'm going to take medication and maybe that'll do it, but maybe not. I mean, it was just being at the mercy of my brain. Or with psychology, mainly Freudian analysis, but that kind of idea that we have these dark parts of ourselves that we can't get to without a psychologist helping us, and it just turns out like our brains are primitive. They want to keep us alive. They're doing their best. I like that better. And I like having a relationship with it. But you were talking also about, with eating disorders. I mean, there's no question that has been, I'm amazed at how much not anorexia, but disordered eating lingered with me over the years. So my obsessive compulsive disorder was with food. So for years, I only ate by color. So I would only eat orange foods or I would only eat green foods.
I remember reading that you were in the Roy G. Biv diet. Yeah,
before it was anything. It turns out here I am getting diagnosed with OCD and turns out it's like a really great way to eat, but who knew? But it wasn't coming from a good place. But with that, I think one way I knew, that there were parts of me in every diagnosis. And one way I knew that I was starting to heal, and we can talk about this, but as I said, I have healed completely from mental illness, even though we're told that we can't. But one way with the anorexia that I knew I had was I threw away my scale. And I thought, wow, because I used to use it as a way to really speak down to myself, to judge myself. It was never the perfect weight. It was never going to be the perfect weight because our bodies fluctuate with weight. So like pick a number and you're not going to be at that number, tomorrow or next week. You're going to be, I was either too low or too high. And it was just a game, and so that was one way, I think, especially as a woman socialized in the United States, that's such a big, difficult thing to know. Like, okay, is this just regular disordered eating or is this a problem?
Absolutely. Yeah. Speaking of your healing journey, a big part of it you talked about earlier was having help through your family. And no matter what someone maybe is going through, whether they have received a diagnosis that is factual, one that they're questioning, or just somewhere in between, I think one of the biggest detriments to our mental health and healing journey, aside from our own ability or courage, really courage to prioritize it as much as any other aspect of our health, is when we don't have help. And I know your family was a big part of that. So how much of a contributing factor was your family to your healing journey? Did you feel like that it hindered you at all? Was it a yet another handicap of being, all right, come back home, stay in here with us, almost being coddled? Or was it what you needed? And where do you stand on it now?
I mean, I kind of wish it was that, but in actuality, what happened, I should paint a clearer picture of it. My parents are divorced. My father's remarried. I had been ill for so long. I really pushed him away. I blamed him for a long time. I mean, I was very distant from my family. I really missed my niece and nephew growing up. I was just not available. And so it was not a like homecoming in any way. And I had finished my PhD. I mean, one thing I was good at was school and teaching. I mean, but there's something also to remember about that. So I've been very successful. There's no question. I'm very grateful for that. But academia is a very forgiving environment in terms of these things. It's a very understanding environment. Yeah. So I was very privileged in that. I was not in an office. I did not have to be there 9 to 5, so it was an accommodating profession to be in. And I'm a writer. So that's at home, and I can do that. But so my parents were divorced. I was estranged from my father. We hadn't talked in about a year, I think. But I was staying with my mother, and it soon became clear that I was living with her. But it was really not ideal for her. And it was a huge strain. And after 5 years, I moved out simply because she was beaten down. I mean, it was so clear after being on suicide watch for a year. I mean, that's too much to ask of anyone. And, to give myself some grace, what could I was doing the best I could. And I wish I could give her those years back if I could do anything, but, but that was a great gift. But in answer to your question, moving out was a shock to the system. But one thing I do know, and that we know, and this is, not just coming from me, but other people in the mental health community, and Thomas Insel, who was former head of the NIMH, the National Institute for Mental Health, has written about this in his new book, Healing, The Path from Mental Illness to Mental Health, which is a wonderful book. But one thing that we know about healing from mental illness or any type of mental health distress is that the 3 Ps, like the letter P, they call them the 3 Ps, are very important. And it's people, place, and purpose. And so just thinking about that, I had all 3. And so I think that those are things that we can have too much of or not enough of. And so staying with my mother, I mean, there's no question that after a while, I think needing to leave was a good thing ultimately, even though I really struggled once I left. But she was just, it was too much for her. She was, 76 years old. It was not, you can't ask someone, I mean, you can, and she's the most loving, giving person. She would have kept going. But this is all to say about the 3 Ps that, we can all think about that, a little bit more and try to give that to each other when we think about, we're just sort of helpless in this. If you can't open, this isn't to say families should, necessarily allow someone to move back in. Sometimes there are boundaries that are crossed and that can't happen.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's understandable, but we can try to create, kind of environments that are beneficial to people or can help with that. Certainly, at the very least, we can get people off the streets and we can get people out of prisons who are suffering from mental illness, that shouldn't be there. But I think people can also extend to, I'm a very solitary person. And one thing I'm really into lately is connecting with strangers, not in a weird way, but cute dogs. I do the cute dog thing.
It's never a bad thing. Yeah.
The cute dog is such an easy connection. And it really is a huge people connection for me because I don't need a lot of connection. So it doesn't have to be family necessarily. You just have to feel like you're connecting. And then purpose, can be anything. And for me, it was always writing and teaching. That has always been where I, direct myself toward, but it could be, like anything, like going to the gym twice a week, connecting with people there, starting to think of that as a second home, or, it could be anything really.
What about now? You made a very bold statement, and I believe you, that you have cured yourself. You are no longer suffering from these mental health illnesses. But you're still human. And so much of what you've been talking about, we all can relate to, these little symptoms and experiences of a lot of these diagnoses. Do you still find yourself maybe with a trigger? Does something kind of set you off now, or is it just perspective that, my response to this in the past definitely could have been much, much different than what it is now? And to kind of piggyback off of that question, is it just your interpretation of your mental health that has evolved and gotten better, and or are we, the collective we, the mental health of the healthcare system, are we getting better at diagnosing mental health?
Those are such great questions. I mentioned that I'm writing the sequel to Pathological now, which is all about how I healed, and really the journey that I went on, which was a rough and tumble journey. I have to say, it was not easy. I live in a way that a lot of people probably wouldn't be willing to live. I don't do drugs. I don't drink caffeine. I don't have any caffeine at all. I go to bed at the same time every night. I wake up at the same time every night, like a child. I mean, these are things that a lot of,
you're in a safe space with the sleep. I respect sleep strongly. Yeah. So you're good there.
Very important. But I have a very, routine day every single day, simply because, like, when you think about it, I was in and out of partial hospitalization programs. They're routine. They give you routine. That's why they help you get better. So, the best sort of metaphor for mental illness that I've ever heard came from Thomas Insel, actually, who I mentioned, former head of the NIMH. And he said that having a crisis, like a mental illness crisis or a mental health crisis, is like breaking a bone. And what's fascinating about, in physical medicine, when you break a bone, when it heals, the point of the break becomes the strongest part. And I just thought that's so beautiful, and how I feel about what I went through. It turns out it doesn't remain the strongest part, but that's okay, because we don't need just one part of the bone to be strong. But what I see for myself is I basically probably over 25 years broke most of the bones in my body. And I now live as someone, I respect that. I respect what I went through. And that's why I live the way I do, not in fear that something's going to come back, or that I am living with this, mental illness lurking in me at all times. At the same time, we all know that it could happen to us, right? And I don't mean that to frighten anyone or whatever.
As long as we're alive and we choose to get out of bed every day, it's pretty much inevitable that something unpleasant is going to happen to you.
And it's such a confluence of factors they now know. Like, as I said, it's partly biology. So how you're living, obesity can have play a role in it. Heredity may play a role. Stress in your life may play a role. So just imagine a perfect storm. That could happen. And then you could go into a depressive episode so extreme that you do need help. But the thing I was told that I would love to see gone from what I want to see in the mental health conversation, let's talk about it in the positive, is the word recovery in every single conversation about mental illness or mental health diagnoses. Because I was told with each diagnosis that I would have it for the rest of my life, that I would never get well. And there's no evidence for that, none. And so much of what we need now is for people to be told, and this is what I'm trying to do with my book, is it's possible. Not everyone will. And that's okay too. That doesn't, I'm not stronger than anyone else. In some ways, I kind of got lucky when you think about it. I mean, it was hard work, but at the same time, when we think about those confluence of factors, well, the same confluence of factors had to come together for me to heal. I mean, I think that
Yeah.
that's a great way, and it's going to look different for every person. My way is not the right way. I'm just writing the book to give people ideas of things they can do, and trying to give them real like action steps in that sense. And also just to tell my story so we can have more stories of healing. I want this to become a well-worn genre, like the mental health recovery, you know. And normally what happens is in mental illness memoirs is people get better, but they live in the identity of their diagnosis forever. And the difference for me is what's interesting is, I mean, it gets more complicated, but I am still on medication and I always will be. And the reason is it could be that it's helping me. I don't know. But if it is, let's just say, the way I see that is that's not a confirmation that I still have a mental illness. I take vitamins. Doesn't mean I'm sick. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's the same. I could think of them as being the same thing because we really don't know how psychotropic medications work. But the other part of it is, and we do know this, and no one told me this either, but you do build up a dependence on SSRIs and that sort of thing. And I have tried to come off them, and the withdrawal was so brutal. I almost died. I will never try again. So it could be that my body is simply dependent on them. And I'm just kind of going with either one, and that's fine. So because I am on medications, I still see a psychiatrist every year, just like I see a GP, just like I see my, for my health. And I think that's not a bad idea. I don't think people should think I'm healing, I'm free, I'm going to go party. That wouldn't be a bad idea for me, having broken every bone. It just would not be, respectful of what I've been through.
True. Yeah.
And seeing a doctor is, should be kind of pro forma if you have health insurance and can do that. But I do have a diagnosis. I don't know what it is. I've asked him not to tell me. And partly because I think I would start to identify, I still have terrible crushing waves of depression. I have crippling anxiety. I mean, there's no question, but I can't attribute it to a diagnosis because I don't know what my diagnosis is. And it's forcing me to really live in the world. And this isn't to say that someone with a diagnosis doesn't live in the world, but this was just my experience because I over-identified. Now I have to say, all right, I'm like, anxiety is like destroying me right now. I don't even feel like I can leave the house. What's going on? And sometimes nothing's going on. And my brain is just overactive. It's just protecting me in that way. Sometimes things are going on and I've taken on too much or whatever it might be. So that's been really beneficial is, again, that distance from the diagnosis was just really important for me.
I've never heard that before. I've never, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just kind of assuming, all right, you present to your doctor, your psychiatrist, your provider, hey, I'm experiencing these things. And based on these things, these symptoms and the level to which, you are saying they are diminishing your life or limiting your life, the doctor does his thing or her thing, does labs, does all these tests, and then just advises, hey, based on what you are telling me, what I'm seeing, here's how I would advise you to mitigate these things and to improve your life without actually saying, hey, oh, yep, it's this thing, you have this thing, therefore you need to deal with it in these ways. Am I understanding correctly?
Are you asking like what would a world without diagnosis look like? Yeah. I mean, my situation is that it's the I don't know doctor. Once he said I don't know, I never asked. I mean, he tried, this is in the book, but the new book, but he did try to tell me, and I would say, no, don't tell me. And I know he's changed it twice. I don't know what's on there. And, again, so I could call him right now and find out, but I don't want to ask. I mean, but it's a great kind of thought experiment. What would it look like? And I found in my research, what I've discovered was up until the 1980s, patients didn't know their diagnoses at all. No one did. You just got treatment. And diagnoses were what they were originally intended for, which was for doctors to communicate. They were a way for doctors to communicate about patients. They were never meant to be memes. They were never meant to be, things that TikTok therapists diagnose. And they certainly weren't meant for us to see ourselves in. And I think that's just important to note. If you get a positive from seeing yourself in a diagnosis, like it brings relief or it's an explanation, brilliant, like go for it. That's great. But my experience wasn't that. I did not get positives from doing that. That was, again, just my experience. But I think what you're saying is so interesting. What I know psychiatrists ideally want is exactly what you said, which is that they would have labs and they would, but we don't have that right now, right? So you can't take a blood test or, an x-ray or anything along those lines. But what I kind of live in is I think it's called an intradiagnostic model. But anyway, there are people who really just want to not dispense with diagnoses, but to start to look at different ways of clustering what happens when someone experiences a mental health crisis or a mental health difficulty. And we would get away from the diagnoses in the DSM because they really are cultural constructions at this point. More than anything, like what's the stereotype of of someone with schizophrenia? Oh, living on the street, like crazy, speaking to the sky. Well, that's not someone with schizophrenia. That's a stereotype of that. What's a stereotype of a woman with depression? What's a stereotype of a, man with bipolar disorder, whatever it might be. And so to get away from that, I think, we're going to need to change. I don't know how likely that change will be, but.
Yeah, that really does. It really, really makes me think about, especially when we're talking about mental health. Imagine if, of course, to safe levels, but imagine if we were never diagnosed with something, but rather we just knew that we were in the right place with the right person, getting the right treatment to make things more manageable based on the symptoms we were experiencing and the aspects of our lives and just direction maybe of our life and our day-to-day life that we didn't thoroughly enjoy. And then just, little by little, we got better. We managed it and we had a better understanding with it. Imagine how much better we would, this is a big assumption here, but imagine how much better we could be because of the extreme amount of stress that we're not now having with it. And we know that exacerbates so many mental and physical health problems. Just stress compounds, it compounds, and makes everything worse. And I'm sure it adds to seclusion. You don't want to open up as much. You don't want to share certain diagnoses with friends and family, like you were saying, due to fear of stigma and stereotype, and you become more recluse, and it's just, a downward spiral from there. But just imagine if that went away and the only thing that happened was management and treatment and help, and we just got better.
And then we'd have to express. I didn't even know what an emotion was until last year.
Wow,
I'm 50 years old. That should have happened sooner. Shit. I didn't even know that they were vibrations in your body and sensations and, physical experiences. And that was really? Wow. I had no clue.
Talk about learning your body in a whole new profound way. Yeah,
absolutely. And so it would force us again to try to look at the whole picture. So heredity, family experience growing up, personality, we'd have to talk about all those things. Maybe biology would come into it, but certainly triggers, as you said, life situation, what's going on. Those would be the kinds of conversations we're having. And one thing I speak about a lot as a public speaker is how diagnoses lead to self-stigma. And that self-stigma, we talk about stigma a lot, but I think self-stigma is more damaging perhaps than even stigma can be, because a lot of us are self-stigmatizing without ever having run into
we're our worst
someone
critics.
Actually.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And so you'd never have to, why would you have to say to someone, I've been diagnosed with depression? Why couldn't we say, let's say to a young person, especially, who's 12 years old, who just lived through a pandemic and spent 2 years in his bedroom, you are going through something unbelievable. Yeah. You are strong. This will pass. Yeah. I'm not trying to make less of it, but you will get better. And we're going to go through this together. And guess what? We all go through these experiences.
You're not alone. To see it. Absolutely. You're not alone.
And that it's a depressive experience, or they used to call them actually in the DSM-2, it was called a depressive reaction and an anxious reaction. I think it was an anxiety reaction, but the word reaction was in there and they took it out to make it sound more medical. But I think the reaction is so great because it's not in you. It's not inescapable. It's, it's not like you can't ever heal. It's just, it's all these other factors that we need to, that come together. But one of the big ones is what's happening in your life.
Yeah, and my brain with analogies always kind of goes back to my fitness roots, and I'm just thinking, I like to train bodybuilding style. I'm not a bodybuilder. I like to power lift. I'm not a power lifter. I like to do yoga. I'm not a yogi. I like to eat vegetables. I'm not a vegetarian. I really like to eat meat. I'm not a carnivore. I'm just someone who's aware of all these different things that are meaningful to me. And then when I have more or less of some of them, I feel some kind of way. So then I naturally gravitate towards them. Yeah, it's really powerful.
I love that. And it's so true. And again, it goes to, if mental health diagnoses were positive, like if they were empowering, then yeah, because there's a lot of safety, like going back to our brains that are always looking for danger. The brain likes certainty, and it likes comfort, and it likes something. So when someone says you have major depressive disorder, for me, it was like a little bit of a sugar high at first. It was like, ooh, the answer. Okay, we got it now, and like now we're certain and we're good. And it would last like maybe a week or two. And then, I'd be back with myself and back with the same emotions and the same thoughts and behaviors that we're all going to be struggling with.
Well, Sarah, you've painted a picture of a unique experience, and I just want to honor your life experience and your story. Thank you again so much for being here with us today and quite literally writing the book about it, Pathological, the true story of 6 misdiagnoses. And thank you so much for shining especially this light on our mental health and helping us connect all these dots. And learning more about what's going on up here, I believe, can help us connect more to down here, to connect the head and the heart, so that we can learn more about ourselves and put one step forward and to move forward in life. And that's what the show is all about, to live a life ever forward. And so I want to ask you, when you hear those 2 words, what does that mean to you? How do you live a life ever forward?
It's always going to be respecting what I went through and looking to the future. So doing both at the same time, not denying what's happened and always looking toward the future and my health.
Respecting what you went through. I love that. Yeah, that's a great place to start. If we all just practiced respecting what we went through, respect in and of itself is huge and is a huge teacher. So that's a great takeaway. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a rich conversation. I loved it.
My pleasure. My pleasure.